True. Okay. Today we are pleased to have joining us Rabbi Edmund H. Weiss. Rabbi Weiss received ordination after a career as a television producer and as Associate Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication. Edmund's address today is called The Enlightenment and Its Enemies, Why Superstition Persists and Spreads. Edmund.
Again, my name is Edmund Weiss, he, him, and you can just call me Edmund. I don't need a title. The only title I ever really enjoyed was professor, but I don't get to be called that anymore. Just Edmund is fine. And I want to thank Mike Blacksmith for inviting me here today. The list of people you've had speak to you is a pretty distinguished crowd, and I'm humbled to be included among them. I want to thank my friend of more than 40 years, Bob Steinfort, for making me known to the organization. And I also want to thank Betsy Lightborn, who just handles things in such a way that it couldn't be easier for me to do this. I'll tell you something about myself a little bit beyond what Mike said. For the past 60 years, I just turned 80. Isn't that awful? I've been a TV producer. I've been a technical writer. I've been a contract researcher. I've been a corporate trainer. I was associate dean at Annenberg, but just for 1 year. And I've been a professor, but just for 10 years. I was the president of my own little training company for about 20 years. And I wrote about a half dozen books. I say about because I don't know if the second edition counts as another book. When I was pushed out of my last university job, I was only 62 and I got bored, and I found an obscure Jewish seminary in Manhattan, and I went there and I earned my rabbinical ordination. I became a rabbi at 75 years old, which I think is a good age to do that sort of thing. I'm probably not like the other rabbis you know. My beliefs are not that far from Felix Adler's beliefs. And for the record, I consider myself a Spinozan rabbi. That's Spinoza from Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher. I may be the only one in the whole world, so later on I'll explain what a Spinozan rabbi is. I'm not a congregational rabbi. If I occasionally use the phrase my synagogue, that'll simply be the one I go to, not the one I'm the spiritual leader of. My topic today is the Age of Enlightenment. Although this period had many precursors, the full-blown Enlightenment that we're talking about emerges in the middle of the 17th century. In fact, some people date it to the publication of Baruch Spinoza's major work, The Ethics. It ends, as we'll see, at the end of the 18th century and runs a little bit into the 19th, but we'll talk about that later. Now, as I said, Spinoza is my philosophical god, even though famously he was excommunicated, perhaps the most famous excommunication from the Amsterdam Jewish community, which was filled, by the way, of Portuguese Jews who had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula along with the Spanish Jews by Queen Isabella. When I first met Spinoza, I'm going to confess to you that I wasn't impressed with him, frankly. But the next time I met them, though, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that my scalp tingled and my brain felt like it was on fire. The first time I was 18 years old, and it was 1960. And like most of the intellectual Jewish adolescents of that era, I was a Zen Buddhist existentialist beatnik whose favorite philosopher was Albert Camus. I should say Albert Camus. Innocently, when I went off to college, I chose as my first elective a course called Modern Philosophy, expecting that I was going to spend an enjoyable semester reading Jean-Paul Sartre and that sort of thing. But modern, as it turns out, to philosophers means the 17th century, and particularly that triumvirate of giants, Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. But frankly, I was not impressed with any of them. I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but I was not impressed with any of them, because all they wrote about incessantly was God. And that was a subject that not only bored me, but insulted my intelligence. At that time in my life, I associated with no one who believed in the God that's described in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And I even felt intellectually superior to those who did. In my mind, the existence of God was a closed question, settled centuries ago, and I had dispatched it. I had dispatched that notion of God, the interventionist God, at the age of 9 or 10, along with other childhood myths. But the second time I met Spinoza, he was introduced to me with a strong letter of recommendation by Albert Einstein. I was preparing a lecture on Einstein's miracle year. In 1905, Albert Einstein published 4 scientific papers that turned the world of physics upside down. And not only did he present the notion of the special theory of relativity and of Einstein gravity, but he proved the reality of atoms. You may not realize it, but even up till 1905, there were physicists who doubted that there were such things as atoms. And Einstein not only showed that they existed, he showed you how to weigh them. And as I researched my topic, I uncovered Einstein's frequent references to and admiration for Baruch Spinoza's philosophy and his worldview. And I discovered 2 books that had been published close together. The first was called Einstein's God, and the second was called Spinoza's God, and they seemed to be about the same subject. And then I saw a speech by Rebecca Goldberg, one of my favorites, in which she read a love poem that Einstein had written to Spinoza. Imagine that, a love poem to Spinoza written by Albert Einstein. Now, I don't have that love poem here, but I do have some excerpts from Einstein's memoirs that show you the intensity of this association and its importance. Einstein wrote, Spinoza's worldview is penetrated by the thought and way of feeling which is so characteristic of the living Jewish intelligence. That's a shocker. That's a shocker. I can't think of anything that is recognizably Jewish in the writing of Baruch Spinoza. Moreover, he has been demonized by the Orthodox. He's a devil. He represents, like, the fact that he denies the afterlife makes him a devil in the minds of the teachers in Orthodox schools. Then Einstein says, I feel that I could not be so close to Spinoza were I not myself a Jew, and if I had not developed within a Jewish environment. And here's the sentence that many people know. I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with fates and actions of human beings. Then in another place in his memoirs, he wrote, this sentence has so many moving parts, you have to hold it down on the table when you're reading it. The Jewish God is simply, watch out whenever a scientist says simply, the Jewish God is simply a negation of superstition, and then an imaginary result of its elimination. So the goal, that your goal is ethical action and the spread of justice. In this view, the goal of the Jewish God and the Jewish way of thinking is the elimination of superstition. And I believe we'll be able to show how those are closely connected to each other. And moreover, this God is a product of the imagination, not an actual fact or a being or an entity. So with Einstein's powerful endorsement and the fascinating possibility that there might be a better Judaism nascent in Spinoza's work, I engaged with his small but rather difficult set of texts, and boy, they're hard. And they've rewarded my expectations many times over. The unifying and overarching theme of Spinoza's philosophy, as well as that of the Age of Enlightenment, was the quest for personal freedom through knowledge of the world unobstructed by dogma or traditional narratives. And the avant-garde philosophers of that time, with the winds of the brand new science at their back, and Gutenberg's wonderful printing machine as a tool, advanced the following 4 ideas, the pillars of enlightenment. Rationality and philosophy is the way to think clearly, not a way, the way to think clearly. Natural philosophy, which later was called science, is the only path to factual truth. Humanism, that is benefit to people ahead of all other benefits, is the final test of value in any idea or plan. And progress and improvement is the ultimate objective of civilization. In your case, improvement with respect to the distribution of justice. What made these ideas so revolutionary was that they devalued religion and tradition, characterizing it as superstition and ignorance. Spinoza made it clear in his ethics that he saw the central goal of religion was to make people obedient, not pursuing truth. And the institution at that time that was most at odds with the quest for truth and humanism was ordained monarchy. Monarchy is much more than just a model for selecting leaders. It is an unholy alliance between a state religion and a leader encouraged to believe that he or she was chosen by God Almighty, who personally adds authority to all the monarch's decisions, including the monstrous and depraved ones. I get the sense that even Shakespeare, who wrote volumes about the murders and other crimes of monarchs, also has Claudius in Hamlet talk about the divinity that hedges a king. And I get the feeling Shakespeare actually believed there was such a thing. So if God chooses the monarch's will is divine, and to oppose one is not only treason but blasphemy, and those are two crimes with similar penalties. To underscore how grotesque this union of monarchy and religion was, consider the much celebrated St. Thomas More. Now, many plays, novels, and movies characterize him as a noble martyr for having accepted execution by beheading, rather than agree that Henry VIII's power exceeded that of the Pope. They're still naming Catholic high schools after this fellow, because of his martyrdom. But what most people don't know is that one of the jobs that Thomas More did for his monarch before falling out of favor was to torture and burn alive persons accused of being Lutherans. How's that for a serious crime? That included, by the way, the fellow who wrote the first draft of the King James Bible. His name was Wycherley. Those European countries that successfully overthrew or contained their monarchs in this time owe their ideas to Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau. And note that the language of America's Declaration of Independence borrows such phrases as self-evident truth, right from Spinoza's Ethics, along with nature's God. Spinoza always wrote God or nature. He never wrote God by itself. Spinoza asserted that the only legitimate function of the state, as he saw it, was to guarantee freedom of thought, practice, religion for its citizens. That's the only legitimate function, and that's the motivating idea, I believe, of the Declaration of Independence. Spinoza happened to live in Amsterdam until his expulsion from the community. In that period, it was far and away the most religiously tolerant city in Europe, unless you were a Roman Catholic. In fact, the only time the Jewish community of Amsterdam was harassed by the authorities was when two men speaking Hebrew were arrested by Dutch police who thought they were speaking Latin and therefore must be Catholics. Again, monarchy is the issue. At the beginning of this age, even England terminated its monarchy briefly in 1642 by deposing Charles I and replacing him with a rambunctious parliament that ultimately had to be reined under control by a somewhat aristocratic, I should say autocratic, Oliver Cromwell. But even after beheading Charles I, the project failed, and in 1660, Charles II was crowned, and oddly enough, this year, Charles III was crowned. So what ended the Age of Enlightenment? Most historians claim that it was the bloody aftermath of the French Revolution that soured most intellectuals on enlightened political idealism. Apparently, commoners, given power, could be just as tyrannical and bloody-minded as aristocrats and monarchs. Even movie director Steven Spielberg makes a dark joke in Schindler's List about the barbarism of the most enlightened people in Europe, the Germans, when he has two young Nazi soldiers argue about whether a piece of music is Mozart or Bach, while they are at the same time pillaging a Polish ghetto. Regarding ethics, the Age of Enlightenment may be said to have been bookended by two great philosophical concepts. At the beginning of the age, Spinoza, introduced the notion of the adequate idea. This is an idea that is so clear and logical, so free from the vagaries of temporary passions and contingencies, so grounded in eternal truth, that the idea itself is eternal. He used this phrase sub specie aeternatus, with an eternal perspective, a phrase that Felix Adler liked, by the way. It is so grounded in eternal truth that the idea itself becomes eternal and is in fact the only form of human immortality. Let me share with you, I think, the most potent of these ideas, because it bears directly on ethics. As Spinoza argued that in a rational being, reason, virtue, and freedom are three names for the same thing. Reason, virtue, and freedom are three names for the same thing. This is an important idea, and I find it important because the clearer that idea becomes to me, the more I'm content that I am understanding the ethics, which is a very hard book to understand. Reason, virtue, and freedom are three names for the same thing. So by including virtue, of course, human beings are not only reasonable and free, they are also likely to act in virtuous ways, which Spinoza argued needed no reward other than the feeling of virtue. Now, at the other end of the Age of Enlightenment, we have Immanuel Kant. And he decided for his ethics to formalize the golden rule and create what was known as the categorical imperative. And he offered it in two forms. Many of you in school learned the first and most popular form of it. He wrote, act only according to that maxim or belief by which you can at the same time wish that it would become a universal law. Do unto others, in effect. Only act in a way that the principle which justifies your action is the kind of principle you would like to see universal. Again, do unto others. Now, there are some technical problems with that, and they were worked out in a magnificent book in the 20th century by John Rawls called A Theory of Justice. I imagine that given your interest in the spread of justice throughout the world as a major aim, that many of you are familiar with John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S, Theory of Justice. But if you aren't, I strongly recommend it to you. He solves the philosophical problems in the Golden Rule and the categorical imperative in a very persuasive way. There's another form, however, in which Kant expressed the categorical imperative. And this sentence is so powerful that I get a little shaky when I read it. Sometimes I get the quivers, and sometimes I even tear up a little bit, because I think it may be the solution to all the ethical problems in the world, quite frankly. So act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another, always as an end and never as a means. So, I've got the shivers. So act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another, always as an end and never only as a means. If we treated people as the end of all of our actions and policies, I dare say almost all the evil in the world would vanish. It's exploiting people for other ends that creates most of the horror, I believe, in the universe. I should say in our planet. It is difficult to overstate the transformative power of Kant's writing on morality. It is the apotheosis of the Enlightenment because it authors an ethical model entirely without reference to divinity. It dispatches the maxim which is dear to clergy, that there cannot be a foundation for morality without the divine. As Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor put it famously, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Well, no, it isn't. And again, if you want to see why it's not permitted, read John Rawls. Nietzsche explains that in these and other sentiments, Kant once and for all has taken away from God the only useful job that was left to him, which is to write the laws of morality, and thereby he kills him. Now, while the rest of the intellectual world was growing weary of enlightenment, one small group persisted into the 19th century, particularly in their devotion to Immanuel Kant, the original inventors of Reform Judaism, who are in effect the forefathers of the ethical culture movement. Forefathers is gendered language. I have to think of the ancestors of ethical culture. Moses Mendelssohn, who was a friend and correspondent of Immanuel Kant, wrote, "My religion recognizes no obligation to resolve doubt other than through rational means, and it commands no mere faith to eternal truths." If I remember later on, I'll tell you my major article of faith, by the way. The other inventor of Reform Judaism, Abraham Geiger, wrote that Reform Judaism was not a rejection of earlier Judaism, but a recovery, forgive me for these technical terms, of the Pharisaic and halakhic tradition, which is nothing more than the principle of continued further development in accord with the times, the principle of not being slaves to the letter of the Bible, but rather to witness over and over its spirit and its authentic faith consciousness. I don't know what faith consciousness means, but that's what he said. The reason I'm a Reformed Jew and proud to be one is that I believe that the men who wrote the Talmud were doing what Reformed Jews do today, and that is they were revising, extending, amending, expanding, and in some cases nullifying the Jewish laws that have been written during the biblical era. But since you can't change a letter of the teaching, they called it interpretation. My next anthology of essays is going to be called Jews for Exegesis. We interpret, we never amend. A principal aim of the reformers was to convert Judaism from an all-consuming tribal culture into a very Lutheran-like religion that could be practiced for a few hours a week, which would allow German Jews to participate more fully in the rich academic, social, political, and artistic life of Germany. And the critics of Reform Judaism like to remind us how badly that plan failed. Now, my talk today is called Enlightenment and Its Enemies. We know that people who challenge the authority of kings and clergy make powerful enemies and sometimes pay for their boldness with their lives. But that's not the only enemy I'm thinking about today. This enemy has extinguished much of the light in Reformed Jewish enlightenment, and it's given otherwise intelligent people the right to minimize the value of science and scientists. It's allowed such expressions as your truth and my truth to wriggle their way into our discourse. And it has made possible my second least favorite sentence in the English language: perception is reality. The name of this enemy is Romanticism, the belief in the superiority of feeling over fact and passion over method. Of course, as an artistic and aesthetic movement, Romanticism gave us some of the greatest works made by humankind. You heard one earlier today. It was not a rejection of classicism, which roughly coincided with the age of enlightenment. It was an extension of it, giving the world new forms, new artistic palettes, new possibilities for sensation. Without Romanticism, there is no Brahms double concerto. Without Romanticism, there is no Goya and no Eve of St. Agnes. Imagine a world without those things. In philosophy, however, Romanticism is dangerously close to solipsism, the belief that I'm the only real human being in the world and my feelings define reality. The Romantics reject evolution because it feels so ugly. Romantics know they're in the presence of the God because their chests tingle. Romantic ball players feel that God helped lift that home run out of the park. And romantics know there has to be a heaven because the alternative is too horrifying to contemplate. Now, at first, the Kantian Jews of Germany had great success establishing enlightened, non-romantic Judaism in America. In fact, the earliest of the classic Reform synagogues had an employee whose job was to take a long pole and walk around the sanctuary during services and use this pole to knock off the heads of the congregants hats, kippahs, fedoras that the traditional men had worn to services, because traditionally Jewish men wore a hat to service, and they would knock the hats off of their head to remind them where they were. But later, when the road show of Fiddler on the Roof arrived in New York from the Ukraine in the early 1900s, increasingly the movement became obsessed with Hasidic magic and mysticism. The Jews of Eastern Europe lived in what was essentially Hasidic or Hasidim-like communities. If you want a technical discussion of what that means later about what Hasidim is, I'll give it to you. Increasingly, the movement became obsessed with magic and mysticism, with putting red ribbons on babies' cribs, with spitting on the floor to keep away the evil eye. And then when the Holocaust came, it made the Jews of the world mad with horror and with doubt, causing some to break off once and for all from the idea of an interventionist God who favored Jews. The idea alone was no longer possible, but leaving others plunged even deeper into torturous explanations of how it could have happened, what it could mean, and how they could rehabilitate the God who appeared to have enabled it. There is something called post-Holocaust theology, by the way, a small branch of Jewish studies. And the newest movement of, in the 50s, along came a new kind of Judaism called Reconstructionism. Its founder, Mordecai Kaplan, was the first major rabbi to publicly disavow supernatural Judaism. The Orthodox Jews, by the way, had a public burning of the Siddur, the prayer book he had written. But at the same time, his colleague at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Abraham Joshua Heschel, probably the most popular rabbi of the 20th century, he was urging Jews to live in a perpetual state of joy. That's the essence of Hasidism, by the way. Everything you do should make you feel joyful. And alas, Reconstructionism now also has fallen deep into the throes of mysticism and theory. I didn't mention humanistic Judaism. I don't have time to talk about it, but humanistic or atheist Judaism, also an intellectually brilliant, well thought out branch of Judaism, which deserves more followers than it has, quite frankly, and also quite closely aligned with the Philadelphia Ethical Society and its long-range goals. And the newest movement on the scene, the one that is growing in popularity, is Jewish Renewal, which was actually founded by a rebel Chassid who was determined to reintroduce, here are his words, ancient Judaic traditions of mysticism and meditation, gender equality, and ecstatic prayer to synagogue services, where Reb Zalman finds gender equality in the Jewish tradition is a bit of a riddle, but he says he does. Now, the most popular name for this Jewish religious romanticism is spirituality. The belief that God or other transcendent forces are somehow accessible to the human nervous system and are manifest as feelings. One of the key ideas of Enlightenment science is that the natural universe is indifferent to us. But spiritualistic folks tend to reject that central idea, seeing the world as a system of clues to magical secrets, as well as angels who appear from time to time, or demons who hide in our chimney places to steal away newborn babies. Oh yeah, there's Lilith, the demon who steals away newborn babies on the night before their circumcision. This is the mystical stuff. Steven Pinker, you know him, he wrote a book called Enlightenment Now. He says they want the laws of physics to care about us. Steven Pinker, by the way, is the husband or partner of Rebecca Goldstein, the woman I mentioned earlier. Boy, would I like to have lunch with that couple. That would be something. Now, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to have a Q&A in a little while after you do some society work. But I want to leave one more idea hanging in the air before I end my presentation. The Romantic era in poetry, and what an era that was. The Romantic era in poetry made extensive use of a device called the pathetic fallacy. It's a little like personification, where a non-human thing is given human traits, as in Homer's rosy-fingered dawn, you know. The pathetic fallacy, though, gives human feelings to a non-human entity or creature. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Wish I'd written that. Now, this device produces some really grand poetry and prose. But the problem is when you get confused and think it's true, that clouds are lonely. The book that best illustrates the danger of the pathetic fallacy and of spirituality in general is, to my mind, another great product of the Romantic era, Moby Dick. As you recall, the central character, Moby Dick, is Captain Ahab, and he is the ultimate romantic poet. He's had a nearly fatal run-in with a big white whale, and since that time, he has attributed to this whale every evil thought, every malevolent intention, every murderous objective imaginable. The narrator of the book, who calls himself Ishmael, says, all evils to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. Now, what too many English teachers fail to emphasize when they teach this book is that the whale Moby Dick is an utterly innocent creature, led by his ordinary appetites and moving through life exactly as his instincts drive him. He wishes to eat and survive, and any killing he does is merely his living process. He doesn't know what a Captain Ahab is. It is Ahab's spirituality, his belief that Moby Dick is a devil with an urge to blot out Ahab. It is his spirituality. That is what kills the captain and all but one of his crew members, who is escaped alone to tell thee. Thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it now back to Mike.